Hey everyone, I'm here with Captain Daniel Andrews, Executive Director for Captains for Clean Water. Today we hope to inform you on this current red tide situation and answer a lot of the questions you guys have been asking. So I'd like to start by just giving a brief overview about what red tide is. Where does it start, where does it come from, and how does it behave?
So red tide is a single-celled organism, a type of phytoplankton called Karenia brevis that has been in the Gulf of Mexico since before people were in Florida. And those blooms start offshore, typically 30 to 40 miles or further offshore. They get blown inshore and can feed off of coastal nutrient sources. And you see that especially after a hurricane, like Hurricane Ian had storm surge and record rainfalls. All that brought nutrients into the water and led us to the point where we're at today with this bloom.
So you mentioned that red tide starts offshore, but then how do we see, or why do we see all of these dead fish along the beaches?
So the most nutrient-rich water we have in the Gulf of Mexico is going to be closest to the shore, especially along the west coast of Florida. You see a lot of nutrient sources, from Lake Okeechobee discharges to other forms of nitrogen and phosphorus that make their way into the water. And when the red tide comes in there, it's not a picky eater, so it'll make use of those nutrients, and the blooms generally are a lot more severe closer to the coast.
Is it typical for this time of year, we're early spring, is it normal to see a red tide to this extent right now at this time period of the year?
Generally, we don't see red tides as significant as the bloom we have right now this time of year. However, it is pretty typical to see a bloom like this after a hurricane. We saw something like this after Hurricane Charlie and after Hurricane Irma, which were the last two major hurricanes that came through the Gulf and made landfall on the west coast.
So you mentioned that this current red tide is mainly due to Hurricane Ian. What is it about a hurricane that can cause a bloom like we're seeing right now?
So first of all, Hurricane Ian caused an upwelling event in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's always red tide somewhere, usually in the bottom, in the sand, and that got brought up to the top. Along with that, it stirred up the Gulf of Mexico, pushed a lot of different nutrients from within the Gulf and just kind of mixed everything up. Those blooms came inshore, and what we had was significant rain from Boca Grande north and then storm surge from Boca Grande south, all of which brought debris from the land, leaves, fertilizers, all different types of nutrient sources from the land got washed into the waterway. So following the hurricane, the west coast of Florida had just a nutrient-rich estuaries all the way from Tampa south. And red tide is not a picky eater, and it makes use of any and all of those nutrients, especially the nitrogen. So when those blooms were pushed inshore, they started feeding off that, and what we had happen was a bloom that sustained all winter and into the spring.
So I see a lot of people claiming that, red tide is completely natural, it's been going on since the beginning of time, and that you have nothing to worry about. This is just a way of life in Florida. What would you say to that?
So red tide is natural. It's been here longer than we have, but we are making it a lot worse. Just like any algae, it's not something new that we've created, but by putting nitrogen and phosphorus into the waterways, we're making a lot of different algae blooms worse. And for red tide specifically, the Lake Okeechobee discharges, fertilizer pollution, any sources of nitrogen and phosphorus can make the bloom a lot worse. So there's things we can do to make these blooms better, and we shouldn't just write that off because these blooms are naturally occurring.
So what are some of the factors that turn a red tide bloom into a super bloom like we saw in 2018, and kind of explain what happened in 2018?
So 2018 was really like the perfect storm for a red tide bloom. You had Hurricane Irma, which came and put record amounts of rain on the land, washed a ton of nutrients into the water. It stirred up the Gulf of Mexico, brought those blooms inshore, and we had a persistent bloom from the summer of 2017 all the way through into the summer of 2018. And because Lake Okeechobee was high from Hurricane Irma, the summer rain started early. The water levels in Lake Okeechobee continued to rise, and the discharges down the Caloosahatchee River increased pretty early into the wet season. And with those discharges came very high levels of nutrients, Lake Okeechobee was stirred up still from the hurricane a year before, and all that nutrient-rich water was just like throwing fuel on a forest fire for the red tide bloom. And throughout the duration of those discharges, that bloom got worse and worse. July, August, into September was one of the worst red tide blooms I've ever seen.
So right now, where are we at as far as the lake levels and the forecast for this summer? Like, what do you think is on the horizon for us?
So the lake is very high right now, and just like after Irma, the lake is stirred up. We have a similar scenario. There's a lot of muck in the lake, and when a hurricane comes over, it stirs up the lake, which is high potential for blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, but also there's more nutrients in that water if it were to be discharged. And the lake is almost 15.5 feet in early March, which is very high. And right now we're kind of at the mercy of the weather. If we have an early start to rainy season and a very wet rainy season, we're likely to see Lake Okeechobee discharges, which will likely make the situation a lot worse. But it's tough to say at this point how that's going to pan out. It's really just a function of the weather.
So you mentioned the lake is really high right now. We already have this red tide bloom. Is there any sort of solutions in place that people can get behind?
There are long-term solutions to this problem that will provide lasting relief to Southwest Florida and really all of South Florida. And that is Everglades Restoration and better operations of Lake Okeechobee. The Army Corps of Engineers is about to adopt a new plan to manage Lake Okeechobee, which will provide significant relief to these discharges, about a 37% reduction annually, as well as Everglades Restoration projects like the EAA Reservoir, which is the crown jewel of Everglades Restoration. That's a project that's currently underway, and we're fighting and pushing to have that project expedited so it can be done as soon as possible. And a third outlet at that point will exist south of Lake Okeechobee. So rather than having to unnaturally discharge all that heavily polluted water to the west coast and the east coast, exacerbating the red tide blooms and cyanobacteria blooms, that water can be sent into the reservoir where it can be stored, flowed through wetlands where the nutrients can be removed from the water, and then clean water can be sent down to the Everglades where it's desperately needed. And that's a solution that will benefit all of South Florida and provide a more resilient environment and ultimately a more resilient economy. So we're not having to deal with these supercharged red tide blooms as frequently as we have.
So is there anything further that you would want, the people, our supporters, to know?
Nutrient pollution is a worldwide problem. When nutrients get into waterways, they're very hard to get rid of them. But we have a very unique opportunity in South Florida right now. The largest ecosystem restoration project ever undertaken in the history of the world is Everglades Restoration, and it provides an opportunity to rehydrate wetlands in the southern part of the state and to build reservoirs and treatment wetlands to where we can make use of what used to be a natural filtration system in South Florida. And we have a great plan to do that, a science-based plan that it has incredible scientific consensus to build these series of engineered projects to take Lake Okeechobee's polluted water, store it, clean it, send it south. And in doing so, it alleviates a lot of different problems that we're facing in South Florida right now. The toxic cyanobacteria discharges, red tide problems, aquifer, saltwater intrusion into aquifers. All these problems, all these symptoms can be significantly alleviated by advancing the science-based solution that's been there for a very long time. It's lack of political will and lack of funding at the state and federal levels that have allowed these projects to just kind of sit by with no progress happening at all on them. And the way that we move forward is the same way that Captains for Clean Water has been moving the last 7 years, which is to bring people to the table, to educate people, make them aware of these science-based solutions, and give them opportunities to be part of the solution. It really is just as simple as using your voice in a constructive, targeted way to get our policymakers to see that there's a lot of challenges. We have a lot of problems with our waterways, but there's a huge solution that's on the table, that momentum's happening on it. We just need to expedite that. And that's what we're here to do. And this crisis that we're experiencing right now, and it may get worse this summer, but it needs to be a wake-up call to a lot of people to get involved, to better educate themselves on these problems, and ultimately to be part of the solution so that future generations don't have to deal with what we've had to deal with for decades now.